Marie
Oh my
Carpenter's truck
goodness.
kicked up dust clouds
Thank
that
you.
hung in the still air like ghosts refusing to settle. The engine rattled worse each day, but she couldn't bring herself to fix it. Some things were meant to break down slow, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the memory of what they used to be. The dirt road stretched ahead of her like a scar across the land, cutting through fields that had gone to seed years ago, when the last of the farmers gave up and moved to the cities. She was thinking about Tommy again, 3 years dead and still taking up space in her head, like he was sitting right there in the passenger seat, drumming his fingers against the window the way he used to when he was nervous about something. The therapist in the county seat had told her that grief was like that it would sneak up on her in quiet moments and catch her off guard. What the therapist hadn't told her was that sometimes grief felt like drowning in shallow water, where you could see the surface but couldn't quite reach it. The broken mailbox appeared through the heat shimmer like something from a bad dream. It leaned at an angle that suggested violence, the kind of casual destruction that happened when people stopped caring about things that used to matter. Marie slowed the truck without really thinking about it, her foot finding the brake pedal the way it might find a familiar step in the dark. That's when she saw the girl. She stood beside the mailbox like she'd been waiting there forever, thin as a reed and twice as fragile. No shoes on her feet, no coat despite the morning chill that still clung to the air. Maybe 8 years old, maybe 10. Hard to tell with children who'd learned to make themselves small. Her dress was too big, hanging off her shoulders like a hand-me-down from someone who'd outgrown kindness along with clothes. Marie pulled over without hesitation. The truck's engine coughed twice and went quiet, leaving only the sound of wind moving through dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling something it couldn't quite catch. She climbed out of the cab and walked toward the girl, already pulling off her flannel shirt. The morning air bit at her arms through the thin tank top underneath, but she'd been cold before. Cold was something you could live with. Here, Marie held out the shirt. Take this. The girl looked up at her with eyes that belonged on someone much older, dark eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything they'd witnessed. She didn't move toward the shirt, didn't step back from it either, just stood there like she was weighing options that adults had taught her to consider carefully. I ain't asking for nothing, the girl said. I ain't asking if you are. Marie stepped closer, close enough to see the dirt under the girl's fingernails and the way her hair had been cut with kitchen scissors by someone who didn't know how to cut hair, close enough to smell the unwashed smell of someone who'd been living rough, sleeping in places that weren't meant for sleeping. The girl reached out and took the flannel shirt. Her hands were small and cold when they brushed against Marie's fingers. She pulled the shirt over her head, and it swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging past her wrists, the hem falling almost to her knees. But it was warm, and Marie could see the way the girl's shoulders relaxed just a little bit, the way some of the tension went out of her face. Thank you, the girl said. Marie nodded and turned back toward her truck. She had groceries in the back that needed to get home before the ice cream melted, bills that needed paying before the lights got shut off again. She had a life that was small and manageable and didn't include taking care of other people's problems. She'd learned that lesson the hard way when Tommy was alive, learned it again when he died. She was reaching for the truck door when the girl spoke again, her voice soft and clear in the morning air. Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door and the truth from the liars. Marie's hand froze on the door handle. The world went quiet around her, like someone had turned down the volume on everything that existed. No wind, no hawk, no sound of her own breathing. Just those words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that should have been dead and buried 3 years ago. She turned around, slow, afraid that sudden movement might break whatever spell was holding this moment together. The girl stood there in the too big flannel shirt, looking back at her with those ancient eyes. What did you say? But the girl was already walking away, stepping carefully through the tall grass that grew wild along the roadside. The shirt flapped around her like wings that weren't quite ready for flight. Hey, Marie called after her. What did you say? The girl didn't turn around, didn't slow down. She moved through the grass like she knew exactly where she was going, like she'd walked this path 1,000 times before. The stalks bent and swayed around her, creating a trail that closed up behind her as she passed. Marie stood beside her truck and watched the girl disappear into the field, swallowed up by grass and distance and the kind of impossibility that happened in dreams. Her hands were shaking now, trembling against the warm metal of the door handle. Tommy's prayer, the words he whispered every night before bed when they were kids, when their father's drinking got bad and their mother's silence got worse. The prayer she'd taught him when he was scared of things that moved in the dark, scared of truths that grown-ups tried to hide behind lies that weren't quite big enough to cover everything. No one else knew that prayer. She'd never told anyone, not even after Tommy died. It was something private between them, something that belonged to the space where childhood ended and the real world began. Marie climbed back into her truck and sat there for a long time, staring at the place where the girl had vanished into the grass. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing and wheezing like an old man with too many years and too many regrets. She drove home with Tommy's prayer echoing in her head and the taste of impossibility sharp on her tongue. Marie sat in her truck with the engine off and her hands shaking against the steering wheel. The girl was gone, but her voice kept playing in Marie's head like a broken record stuck on the same song. Those words, Tommy's words, words that belonged to a 12-year-old boy who used to whisper them in the dark when their father came home stumbling and mean. The prayer had started as something simple. Marie was 16 then, old enough to know that some nights were worse than others. Old enough to hear the way their mother's voice got smaller when their father's voice got bigger. Tommy would creep into her room when the yelling started downstairs, crawling under her covers like a frightened animal seeking shelter. She could see him now, clear as if he was sitting right there in the passenger seat. Skinny arms and legs, all elbows and knees, hair that stuck up no matter how much water she used to smooth it down. Those big dark eyes that saw too much and understood more than any kid should have to understand. Marie? His voice came to her across the years like an echo in an empty room. You think God really keeps wolves away? She'd been reading him a story about Little Red Riding Hood, trying to distract him from the sound of breaking glass downstairs. But Tommy always asked the hard questions, the ones that didn't have easy answers. If you believe hard enough, Tommy. What about the truth from liars? Marie had looked down at her little brother then. This kid who was supposed to be thinking about toys and cartoons and whether he'd get chocolate chip cookies in his lunchbox. Instead, he was asking about liars like he already knew the world was full of them. Sometimes that's the same thing. She'd made up the prayer that night, pulling words together like she was building a wall around both of them. Something to keep the bad things out, something to help him sleep when sleep felt impossible. She'd whispered it with him every night until their father finally left for good, and even after that, when the habit was too strong to break. Marie started the truck and pulled back onto the road. Her hands had stopped shaking, but her heart was still beating too fast, like it was trying to outrun something that couldn't be outrun. She needed to see Tommy's grave. She needed to kneel beside that stone and ask him questions that dead people couldn't answer. Millfield Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by an iron fence that had more rust than paint. The grass grew wild between the headstones, and half the graves had flowers that had died weeks ago. Tommy's marker was simple granite, just his name and dates, and nothing else. She'd been too broke and too broken to pay for anything fancy. Marie parked beside the cemetery gate and walked through rows of stones that marked lives she'd never known. Old names, new names, babies who hadn't lived long enough to have stories worth telling. Tommy's grave was in the back section where the poor people got buried, where the ground was harder and the shade was thinner. She knelt beside the stone and pressed her palm against the sun-warmed granite. 3 years dead, and she still expected him to answer when she talked to him. How does she know Tommy? The words came out quiet, almost lost in the sound of wind moving through the cemetery trees. How does some shoeless girl know your prayer? The stone stayed silent under her hand. Dead people didn't give up secrets, no matter how much you needed them to talk. I taught that prayer to you, and nobody else. You remember? That night, when Dad broke Mom's favorite plate and she locked herself in the bathroom crying, you were so scared you couldn't stop shaking. Marie closed her eyes and let herself remember that night. The way Tommy had curled up against her like she was the only safe thing in a world full of sharp edges. The way he'd repeated the words after her, stumbling over the harder ones but holding on to the meaning like it was a rope that could pull him out of deep water. I never told anyone else those words. Not Mom before she died, not the therapist, not even the preacher at your funeral. She opened her eyes and looked at Tommy's name carved into the stone. So how does she know? A shadow fell across the gravestone, blocking out the late afternoon sun. Marie looked up to see a man standing behind her, tall and broad-shouldered with gray hair under a sheriff's hat. Sheriff Dalton wore his badge like it meant something, polished bright enough to catch the light and throw it back at whoever was looking. "Marie Carpenter!" His voice carried the kind of authority that expected people to listen when he talked. "Sheriff, been a while since you visited Tommy." Marie got to her feet, brushing dirt off her knees. Dalton was standing too close, the way men did when they wanted to make a point about who was bigger and who was smaller. "Didn't know you were keeping track." "Small town. People talk." "About what?" Dalton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "About folks asking questions better left alone." The badge on his chest caught the sun and threw light across Tommy's headstone like a warning. Sheriff Dalton's shadow still covered Tommy's grave like a dark promise as Marie rose to face him. The late sun caught his badge and threw silver light across the headstone, turning her brother's name into something that flickered and moved. Dalton was the kind of man who filled up space just by standing in it, broad shoulders and thick hands that had seen their share of violence. Marie Carpenter. "Sheriff, been a while since you visited Tommy." Marie brushed the dirt off her knees and tried to keep her voice steady. "Didn't know you were keeping track." "Small town. People talk." "About what?" Dalton smiled, but his eyes stayed cold as winter water. "About folks asking questions better left alone." The badge on his chest was polished to a mirror shine, the kind of perfect that took work to maintain. Marie wondered what else he polished that carefully, what other surfaces he kept clean enough to hide the dirt underneath. "Don't know what you mean, Sheriff." "Sure you do." Dalton stepped closer, his shadow swallowing more of Tommy's grave. "Saw your truck on Mill Road this morning. Old blue Ford with the busted tailgate. Hard to miss." Marie's heart started beating faster, but she kept her face blank. "Checking on Mrs. Henderson's fence. She called about cattle getting through." "Mrs. Henderson?" Dalton nodded like he was considering this. "Nice lady. Shame about her memory going. Makes it hard to know what calls she actually made and what calls she thinks she made." The threat was quiet but clear. Marie felt it settle in her chest like ice water. "Fence was fine. Just a loose post." "I'm sure it was." Dalton pulled off his hat and ran a hand through gray hair that was still thick despite his age. "Thing is, Marie, sometimes people get ideas, especially when they're grieving. Start seeing connections that ain't there." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your brother's case is closed. Has been for 3 years. Accidental overdose. Coroner signed off on it. State confirmed it. End of story." Marie looked down at Tommy's headstone, at the dates that marked the beginning and end of a life that had been cut short. "Tommy never touched drugs." "Your brother was troubled, Marie. Drugs'll take anyone." "Tommy never touched drugs." The words came out harder this time, sharp enough to cut through Dalton's careful politeness. "Grief makes people see things that ain't there." Marie looked up at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dalton put his hat back on and adjusted the brim so it cast his eyes in shadow. "Means some doors stay shut for good reason." "Means poking around in places you don't belong can cause problems for folks who don't deserve problems." "Whose problems?" "Could be anyone's problems. Could be your problems." Dalton's voice stayed friendly, but something dangerous moved underneath the surface. "You got a good job at the diner, Marie. Good customers who like you, boss who trusts you. Be a shame if that changed." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that wasn't supposed to be burning. Marie felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. "You threatening me, Sheriff?" "Just giving advice." "Same advice I'd give any citizen who might be confused about what's best for them." Dalton glanced down at Tommy's headstone, then back at Marie. "Your brother made some bad choices. Don't make the same mistakes he did." "What mistakes?" "Asking the wrong questions, talking to the wrong people, getting involved in things that weren't his concern." Dalton stepped back, his shadow finally releasing Tommy's grave to the sunlight. Tommy thought he was smart, thought he could figure things out that were better left alone. Look where it got him. Marie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your brother took too many pills and died alone in his apartment. That's what the report says. That's what happened. And that's all anyone needs to know." "But what if it isn't what happened?" Dalton's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, long enough for Marie to see something hard and ugly underneath. "Then you better hope nobody finds out different. For your own sake." The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Marie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of secrets pressing down on the conversation like a storm that hadn't broken yet. "Tommy was family, Sheriff. Only family I had left. I know that, Marie. And I'm sorry for your loss. But family or not, dead is dead. And sometimes dead is better left buried." Dalton touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have looked polite if you didn't know better. "You take care now. Stay out of trouble." He walked away between the headstones, his boots crunching on gravel and dead leaves. Marie watched him go, watched the way he moved like a man who owned everything he walked on. The badge on his back caught the light one last time before he disappeared around a bend in the cemetery path. Marie knelt beside Tommy's grave again, pressing her palm against the stone that was still warm from the sun. The silence felt different now, heavier with the weight of things that had been said and things that had been left unsaid. "He knows something, Tommy." The words came out quiet, barely more than a whisper. "He knows something, and he's scared I'm going to find out what it is." The stone stayed silent, but the silence itself felt like an answer. Like Tommy was trying to tell her something that dead people weren't allowed to say out loud. Marie stood up and looked back toward the cemetery entrance where Dalton's patrol car was pulling away, dust rising behind it like a question mark against the sky. 3 years ago, she'd believed the story about Tommy's death because believing was easier than fighting. But now, she had questions that wouldn't stay buried, and a shoeless girl who knew prayers that belonged to the dead. Some doors were meant to stay shut, Dalton had said, but Marie was starting to think some doors were meant to be kicked open, no matter who was standing on the other side trying to keep them closed. Marie drove straight from the cemetery to Pine Street, where Tommy's old apartment building squatted like a broken promise against the darkening sky. 3 years, and the landlord still hadn't bothered to rent out Tommy's place. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split from too many seasons of rain and heat. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, reaching up toward windows that would never see light again. She parked in the alley behind the building where her truck wouldn't be seen from the street. The back window to Tommy's apartment was cracked, held together with duct tape that had gone gray with age. Marie pulled a screwdriver from her glove box and worked at the tape until it peeled away in long strips. The window slid up with a grinding sound that made her freeze and listen for movement inside. Nothing but silence and the smell of dust and time. She climbed through the window and dropped into Tommy's kitchen, landing on linoleum that felt soft and rotten under her boots. The apartment was exactly as it had been the day Tommy died. Dust covered everything like snow that had been falling for 3 years straight. His coffee cup still sat on the counter, brown stains marking the bottom like a ring of dried blood. The refrigerator hummed with the sound of something trying to stay alive in a place where life had ended. Marie moved through the rooms like she was walking through a museum of her brother's last days. His bed was unmade, sheets twisted like he'd been fighting something in his sleep. His clothes hung in the closet, still smelling faintly of the cologne he wore when he went out on Friday nights. She started searching in the bedroom, pulling out dresser drawers and checking behind furniture that hadn't been moved in years. Under the bed, pushed far back against the wall, she found a shoebox held together with rubber bands. Her hands shook as she pulled it out and set it on the mattress. Inside the box was Tommy's real life, the one he'd been living in secret. Letters from the county courthouse with official seals and legal language she didn't understand. Photos of the old Whitmore mine. Pictures taken from different angles like someone was documenting evidence. A spiral notebook filled with Tommy's careful handwriting. Pages and pages of names and dates and numbers that meant something to someone. At the bottom of the box was a child's drawing done in crayon on construction paper, a stick figure girl wearing a shirt that was too big for her, arms hanging past her waist, the shirt colored in blue flannel. Below the drawing, in a child's unsteady writing, were the words, "Tommy's friend." Marie's hands went cold as she stared at the drawing. The girl from the road, the shoeless girl who knew Tommy's prayer, this was her, drawn by someone who had known her well enough to capture the way she looked small and lost inside clothes that didn't fit. She opened the spiral notebook and started reading. The pages were filled with records that looked official but felt wrong. Children's names, ages, physical descriptions, dates marked arrived and relocated. Some entries had notes in margins, questions written in Tommy's handwriting. Where is Amanda Peterson? Lisa Martinez missing from school. No record of placement for James Wright. Marie pulled out her phone and dialed Janet's number. Janet worked the lunch shift at the diner and had lived in town her whole life. If anyone would know about the Whitmore mine, it would be Janet. Hello? Janet, it's Marie. Hey, honey, you okay? You sound strange. Janet, did Tommy ever mention the Whitmore mine? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Marie wonder if the call had dropped. Honey, nobody talks about that place. Why not? Because folks who do tend to leave town real quick. Janet's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Where are you asking from? Tommy's apartment. Jesus, Marie, you shouldn't be there. Why? What happened at the mine? Nothing good. That place has been closed since before you were born, but people still go missing near there. Kids, mostly. Janet paused, and Marie could hear her lighting a cigarette. Tommy came asking me about it maybe 6 months before he died. Wanted to know about the old tunnels, about who had access. What did you tell him? Told him the same thing I'm telling you. Stay away from that place. Some holes in the ground are meant to stay holes. Marie flipped through more pages of the notebook. The dates went back 2 years before Tommy's death, entries marked with increasing frequency as time went on. Some names were crossed out in red ink, others had question marks beside them. Janet, what if Tommy found something? What if he was trying to help someone? Then he should have called the FBI instead of playing detective. Janet's voice got harder. Tommy was a good kid, Marie, but good kids who stick their noses where they don't belong end up dead kids. He didn't overdose. Of course he didn't. Tommy never touched anything stronger than beer. Janet took a long drag of her cigarette. But that's not what the report says. And reports are what matter in court. Marie found a page near the back of the notebook that made her stomach turn cold. A list of names with ages beside them. Sarah, 9. Michael, 7. Hope, 8. All the names had dates beside them. But Hope's entry was different. Instead of relocated, someone had written escaped in red ink. Hope. The shoeless girl's name was Hope. I have to go, Janet. Marie, listen to me. Whatever you think you found, whatever you think Tommy was doing, let it go. Call the state police if you have to, but don't try to handle this yourself. I'll call you later. Marie hung up and turned back to the notebook. Hope's entry had more information than the others. Physical description that matched the girl from the road perfectly. A note about her being uncooperative and asking too many questions. The last entry was dated 1 week before Tommy died. She took photos of every page with her phone, every letter, every picture of the mine. The evidence filled her camera roll with images that felt like they were burning holes in her memory. This was what Tommy died for. This was the secret that Sheriff Dalton wanted to stay buried. Marie heard footsteps on the stairs outside the apartment. Heavy boots climbing toward Tommy's door, taking their time like whoever was wearing them knew exactly where they were going. She shoved the notebook and photos back into the shoebox and tucked it under her arm. The footsteps stopped outside the apartment door. A key turned in the lock with a sound like bones breaking. Marie ran for the back window, climbing through it as the front door opened. She dropped into the alley and pressed herself against the building wall, listening to someone move around inside Tommy's apartment. Whoever it was knew their way around the place, opening and closing drawers with the confidence of someone who had searched there before. She got in her truck and drove away without turning on the headlights. The shoebox clutched against her chest like a shield that might not be strong enough to protect her from what was coming. Tommy had found something at the Whitmore mine, something worth killing for. And now Marie had found it too. Marie drove toward the Whitmore mine as dawn broke over the hills like a wound splitting open in the sky. Tommy's notebook sat on the passenger seat beside her, filled with names and dates that felt like accusations written in her dead brother's hand. The dirt road to the mine was worse than she remembered, full of ruts and washouts that made her truck bounce and rattle with every mile. She'd been to the mine once as a kid, on a dare from older children who said it was haunted. Tommy had been too young then, maybe 7, and she'd left him at home with strict instructions not to tell their parents where she was going. The mine had scared her then, a black mouth in the hillside that seemed to swallow light and sound. Now it felt like something worse, like a throat that had been swallowing children. The sun was just clearing the tree line when Marie reached the chain-link fence that was supposed to keep people out of the Whitmore mine. The fence was intact, but the padlock on the gate hung open, swinging in the morning breeze like a pendulum, counting down to something terrible. Fresh tire tracks led through the gate and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Marie parked her truck behind a stand of pine trees and walked through the gate on foot. The mine entrance was wider than she remembered, a ragged hole in the hillside that looked like it had been torn open by giant hands. Warning signs and faded paint covered the wooden supports, but someone had spray painted over them with words she couldn't read in the dim light. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness ahead of her, revealing a tunnel that stretched back into the mountain like the throat of some massive beast. The air that came out of the mine was cold and damp, carrying smells that made her think of places where things went to rot. Marie walked deeper into the mine, following the tire tracks in the dirt. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the tunnel, coming back to her as whispers and murmurs that sounded almost like voices. The walls were carved from solid rock, but someone had been using this place recently. Fresh scratches marked the stone, and she could see where heavy equipment had been moved through the passages. 20 yards in, she found the first sign that this place wasn't as abandoned as it was supposed to be. A pile of empty food containers sat in a natural alcove, cans and boxes that hadn't been there long enough to rust or fade. Beyond that, a stack of blankets that still smelled like fabric softener. Children's clothes hung from metal hooks driven into the rock wall. Small shirts and pants in sizes that belonged to kids who shouldn't have been anywhere near this place. Marie's hand started shaking as she moved the flashlight beam across the evidence. "What were you into?" "Tommy." Her voice came back to her as an echo that sounded like her brother's name, repeated over and over until it became meaningless sound. She kept walking deeper into the mine, past chambers that branched off from the main tunnel like fingers reaching into the mountain's heart. Some of the side passages had been blocked off with new wooden barriers, but she could see fresh footprints in the dirt leading around them. "What did you find down here?" The words came out quieter this time, barely above a whisper, but the echo picked them up and carried them into the darkness ahead of her like a message meant for whoever might be listening. That's when she saw the light. It wasn't the harsh white of electric bulbs or the yellow flicker of candles. This was something softer, like moonlight filtered through water. It came from deeper in the mine, from a chamber she couldn't see but could feel, pulling at her like gravity made of curiosity and dread. Marie followed the light around a bend in the tunnel and found herself in a natural cavern that opened up like a cathedral made of stone. The walls curved high overhead, disappearing into shadows that her flashlight couldn't reach. And there, sitting on a boulder in the center of the chamber, was the shoeless girl. She still wore Marie's flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up now so her hands could move freely. In the strange light of the cavern, she looked older somehow, like the darkness had aged her in ways that daylight couldn't manage. "You shouldn't be here." The girl's voice carried clearly across the space between them. No echo this time. Marie stepped closer, her boots crunching on loose gravel. "Neither should you. I go where I need to go." "How do you know my brother's prayer?" The girl looked up at Marie with those ancient eyes. "He taught it to all of us." "All of who?" "The ones they said didn't matter." The girl stood up from the boulder, and Marie could see that she was taller than she'd looked on the road, old enough to understand things that children shouldn't have to understand. "The ones they moved through here like we were cargo." Marie felt something cold settle in her chest. "Moved where?" Places where questions don't get asked, places where nobody looks for missing kids. The girl walked closer, and Marie could see scars on her arms, small round marks that looked like cigarette burns. Your brother found us here. Said he was going to help. What happened to him? He got too close to the truth, started asking the right questions to the wrong people. The girl reached out and touched Marie's hand, her fingers cold as winter water. They held him down and made him swallow pills until he stopped fighting, made me watch so I'd know what happened to people who tried to help. The cavern seemed to get colder around them, the strange light flickering like it was fed by something that could run out. How many children? Dozens, maybe more. They bring them in trucks at night. Keep them here until transport comes through. The girl's voice was steady, but Marie could hear the weight of memory in it, the kind of knowledge that left marks on people's souls. Some of them are too young to remember their real names. Some are too scared to try. Marie looked around the cavern and saw details she'd missed before. Sleeping bags rolled up in corners, empty water bottles, a bucket that served as a bathroom. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a way station, a place where people were kept until they could be moved somewhere worse. Why didn't you run? Where would I go? They got people in every town between here and the state line. Sheriff's deputies, judges, social workers. Whole systems set up to move kids like they're cattle. The sound of engines echoed down the tunnel from the entrance, getting closer by the second. Multiple vehicles moving fast and not caring about stealth anymore. The girl grabbed Marie's hand. They found us. We can get out the way I came in. No, they're coming from that direction. The girl pulled Marie toward the back of the cavern, toward a passage that Marie hadn't seen before. This way. Where does it lead? Deeper. Always deeper. The sound of boots on stone came from the main tunnel now, voices shouting orders that echoed through the mine like thunder underground. Marie let the girl pull her into the narrow passage, following her into darkness that felt like it went on forever. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the cavern they'd just left, searching for evidence that someone had been there. Ahead of them, the passage twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, leading them through stone that felt older than the mountain itself. The girl's hand in hers was the only real thing left in a world that had suddenly become impossible. The girl led Marie through passages that twisted deeper into the mountain than any mine should go. The walls here were different, carved from stone that felt older than the earth itself. Marie's flashlight beam showed scratches in the rock that looked like claw marks, but she didn't want to think about what kind of claws could score stone that deep. They walked for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time moved strangely in the tunnels, stretching and compressing like something alive that couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. The girl moved through the darkness like she'd walked these paths 1,000 times, never hesitating at intersections that all looked the same to Marie. Finally, they emerged into a chamber that shouldn't have existed. It was huge, carved from living rock, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows her flashlight couldn't reach. And there, huddled against the walls like frightened animals, were the children. There were maybe a dozen of them, ranging in age from what looked like 6 to maybe 14. All of them were too thin. All of them had eyes that had seen too much, and all of them watched Marie with the careful attention of creatures that had learned the hard way that adults were dangerous. "How many of you are there?" Marie's voice echoed strangely in the chamber, coming back to her as whispers. A boy who couldn't have been older than 10 spoke up from the shadows. "Depends on the day." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes they take some away. Sometimes they bring new ones." The boy's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting facts about the weather. Marie knelt down to be at their eye level. "Who brings you here?" "The men with badges." This came from a girl who looked like she might be 12, her hair cut short and uneven, like someone had used kitchen scissors on it. "Sheriff Dalton?" "Him and others." "Important men." The girl pointed toward the entrance they'd come through. "They wear suits, drive nice cars, talk about us like we're not even there." Marie felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "How long have you been here?" "Time don't work the same down here." The first boy again, speaking with the kind of wisdom that belonged on much older faces. "Could be days, could be weeks. They feed us when they remember to. Give us water when the buckets run dry." The shoeless girl who had led Marie here stepped forward. "Show her." "Marcus." The boy named Marcus walked to the far wall of the chamber and pointed to scratches carved into the stone. "Your brother taught us to keep count. Days we been here, days since we seen sun." He ran his finger along the marks. "Some kids got hundreds of lines before they got moved." "Moved where?" "Don't know. They don't come back to tell us." Marie stood up and looked around the chamber. In the corners, she could see evidence of long habitation, sleeping bags that were more whole than fabric, empty cans that had been scraped clean of food, a smell that spoke of too many people living in too small a space for too long. "Tell her about Tommy," the shoeless girl said. Marcus looked at Marie with eyes that were too old for his face. "He found us maybe 6 months ago. Said he was going to help." "What happened?" "He started coming regular like. Brought us food, blankets, medicine when we got sick." Marcus glanced at the other children like he was checking to make sure it was okay to keep talking. He had a notebook, wrote down our names, where we came from, how long we've been missing. "He was going to save us." This came from the shoeless girl, her voice carrying a weight of loss that made Marie's heart ache. "What happened?" "They found out. Made it look like he took too many pills." Marie felt her hands curl into fists, but Tommy never touched drugs. "They held him down, made him swallow them, made me watch." The words hit Marie like physical blows. She could see it in her mind. Tommy fighting against hands that were too strong, pills being forced down his throat while he struggled and choked and tried to scream for help that would never come. "Why did they make you watch?" "So I'd know what happened to people who tried to help." The girl's voice was steady, but Marie could see tears starting to form in those ancient eyes. "So I'd tell the others to stay quiet and behave." A girl who looked maybe 8 years old spoke from the shadows. "Tommy said he had a sister, said she was strong like him, said if something happened to him, we should find you. That's why you were on the road. Been looking for you since the day they killed him." The shoeless girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Took me this long to get away from them, long enough to find you." Marie felt something break open in her chest, a wall she'd built around her grief cracking and letting all the pain rush in at once. "I'm sorry. I should have known. I should have looked for answers." "You're here now," Marcus said. "That's what matters." The shoeless girl walked to a crack in the far wall, a fissure in the stone that was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "There's something else you need to see." Marie followed her through the crack and into a smaller chamber beyond. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, and she had to grab the wall to keep from falling to her knees. The chamber was full of graves, small mounds of earth marked only with numbers carved into pieces of scrap metal. 20, maybe 30 graves scattered across the floor like a garden planted with the bones of children. The ones who got too sick, the ones who tried to run, the ones who fought back too hard. The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "They bury them here and mark them with numbers instead of names." Marie counted the graves and felt her stomach turn to ice. So many children, so many lives that had been snuffed out and buried in darkness where no one would ever find them or mourn them or remember their names. The sound of voices echoed from the main chamber, harsh and urgent. Men shouting orders, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. "They've found us," the girl said. Marie heard boots on stone, multiple sets moving fast through the tunnels they'd just traveled. The children in the main chamber were scattering like frightened mice, disappearing into cracks and crevices that Marie hadn't seen before. "This way." The girl grabbed Marie's hand and pulled her toward the back of the burial chamber, toward another passage that led deeper into the mountain's heart. The voices were getting closer now, close enough that Marie could make out words. Sheriff Dalton's voice leading the others, giving orders like this was a military operation instead of a manhunt for one woman who had asked too many questions. Marie followed the girl into darkness that seemed to go on forever, leaving behind the graves of children whose names would never be spoken aloud again. Dalton's voice boomed through the mine like thunder trapped underground, echoing off stone walls and coming back as something that sounded more like a roar than human speech. "Marie Carpenter, you're trespassing on county property." The children in the main chamber scattered like ghosts, disappearing into cracks and crevices that Marie hadn't known existed. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had spent months learning how to vanish at the first sign of danger. One moment they were there, huddled against the walls like frightened animals, and the next they were gone, swallowed up by darkness that seemed to bend around them. Hope grabbed Marie's hand and pulled her toward the back of the burial chamber, toward a passage so narrow it looked like a wound in the stone. "This way." "Where does it lead?" "Up. Always up." Marie could hear boots pounding through the tunnels behind them. Multiple sets moving fast and coordinated like a military sweep. Dalton's voice carried over the sound of running feet, barking orders to men whose names she couldn't make out, but whose intentions were clear enough. What about the others? They know how to disappear. Hope squeezed through the narrow opening and Marie followed, her shoulders scraping against stone that felt like it was trying to close in on her. Been practicing for months. The passage was barely wide enough for a grown person, forcing them to move single file through darkness that pressed against them like something alive. Marie's flashlight beam showed rough walls carved from solid rock, scratched and worn by decades of water and time. The air was thin here, stale and cold, carrying the smell of deep places where sunlight had never touched. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but didn't disappear. She could hear Dalton's voice directing the search, spreading his men through the chamber they'd just left. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. How far does this go? Far enough. Hope's voice came back to her as an echo. These tunnels are older than the mine, older than the town. Maybe older than anything. They crawled through sections where the ceiling dropped so low that Marie had to press her face against cold stone to keep moving forward. Her knees were raw from dragging across rough rock, her hands cut and bleeding from trying to find purchase on surfaces that seemed designed to make passage impossible. Hope moved through the darkness like she'd been born to it, never hesitating at intersections, never slowing down even when the way ahead seemed to disappear entirely. She was small enough to fit through spaces that made Marie struggle, but she waited whenever the passage widened enough for them to move side by side. "What's your name?" Marie asked during one of these brief respites. They were in a chamber just large enough for both of them to sit up, catching their breath while the sound of pursuit faded to whispers behind them. "Don't have one anymore." "Everyone has a name." Hope looked at her with those ancient eyes. "Tommy called me Hope." "Hope's a good name. He said his sister would like it." Hope smiled for the first time since Marie had met her, an expression that transformed her face from something haunted into something that looked like what she should have been. A child. Just a child who should have been playing with dolls instead of hiding in mine shafts from men who meant to hurt her. "Tell me about Tommy." Marie kept her voice quiet, aware that sound carried strangely in these tunnels. "He found us maybe 6 months before they killed him, started bringing food and blankets, medicine when we got sick." Hope pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small in the cramped space. "But more than that, he talked to us like we were people instead of things." Marie felt tears starting to form but blinked them back. There would be time for crying later if they lived long enough for later to matter. "He told us about you, said you were strong like him. Said you'd raised him after your parents stopped caring about anything but their own problems." Hope reached out and touched Marie's hand. "He made us memorize his prayer, said if something happened to him, we should find you and say those words so you'd know we were telling the truth." The weight of it hit Marie all at once. Tommy had been preparing for his own death, making sure these children would have someone to turn to when the inevitable happened. He'd known they were going to kill him, and he'd tried to build a bridge between his life and hers, using prayer as the connecting point. "He talked about you all the time, said you used to make him pancakes on Sunday mornings, said you taught him how to tie his shoes and ride a bike and fight back when bigger kids picked on him." Hope's voice got softer. "Said you were the best person he knew." Voices echoed from the tunnels behind them, closer now than before. Dalton had found their trail and was following it with the patience of a hunter who knew his prey was running out of places to hide. "We have to keep moving." Hope nodded and led them deeper into the passage system, through turns and twists that defied any logical layout. Sometimes the tunnels sloped upward so steeply that they had to use their hands to climb. Other times they descended into depths that felt like they were heading toward the Earth's core. Eventually they emerged into daylight, so sudden and bright that Marie had to close her eyes against it. They were on the hillside above the mine entrance, hidden behind a screen of pine trees that had grown thick enough to provide cover. Her truck was visible below them, parked where she'd left it hours ago. "We made it." But Hope was shaking her head, pointing toward the mine entrance where 3 figures stood waiting. Sheriff Dalton with his hand resting on his gun, a man in an expensive suit who could only be County Commissioner Hayes, and beside them, wearing judicial robes like he'd come straight from court, Judge Morrison. They knew where we'd come out. Dalton looked up at their hiding spot and smiled. "Marie Carpenter, come on down here so we can have a conversation." Marie started to stand, but Hope grabbed her arm and pulled her back down behind the trees. "What are you doing?" "Trust me." Hope stepped out from behind the trees, still wearing Marie's flannel shirt, and walked down the hillside toward the 3 men. Dalton raised his gun, pointing it at the child walking toward him, but Hope opened her mouth and whispered something that carried clearly in the still morning air, words that Marie couldn't quite make out from her hiding place. All 3 men froze like they'd been turned to stone. The gun in Dalton's hand started shaking, and Commissioner Hayes took a step backward like he was trying to get away from something he couldn't see. Judge Morrison's face went white as fresh snow. Hope's whisper echoed strangely in the morning air, carrying farther than any child's voice should be able to reach. The words seemed to bend and twist as they traveled, multiplying until it sounded like dozens of voices speaking in unison instead of just one small girl standing alone on the hillside. The shadows around the mine entrance began moving independently of their sources. Tree shadows stretched and writhed without wind to move the branches. The shadow cast by the mine entrance itself seemed to pulse and breathe like something alive, growing darker and deeper until it looked like a wound torn in the fabric of reality. Hope stood perfectly still between Marie's hiding place and the 3 men below, but when she opened her mouth again, her voice carried the weight of others. "We remember everything." Sheriff Dalton's gun hand started shaking harder. The weapon that had seemed so solid and threatening moments before now looked like a child's toy in the grip of a man who was beginning to understand that there were things in this world that bullets couldn't stop. Every face, every name, every lie. Hope's voice multiplied again, becoming a chorus of children's voices that seemed to come from the mine itself, from the earth beneath their feet, from the air around them. Commissioner Hayes took another step backward, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and wrinkled in the strange light that was gathering around them. "This isn't possible. The dead don't stay buried when the truth needs telling." That's when they began to rise. They came up from the mine entrance like smoke given form, dozens of small figures that shimmered between solid and transparent. Children of all ages wearing clothes from different decades, different eras. Some looked like they'd been dead for years, others like they'd died yesterday. All of them had eyes that burned with the kind of anger that only comes from lives cut short by cruelty and greed. Judge Morrison's face went white as courthouse marble. The mine was sealed. "We made sure." Hope looked at him with those ancient eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was layered with the voices of all the dead children surrounding them. "Death don't seal nothing." The ghostly children formed a circle around the 3 men, moving with the fluid grace of smoke, but carrying the weight of accusation. Each one opened their mouth and began to recite Tommy's prayer, their voices joining together in a harmony that made the air itself vibrate with power. "Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door and the truth from the liars." The words came from everywhere at once, from the ghosts, from Hope, from the mine itself. "Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door and the truth from the liars." Dalton raised his gun and pointed it at the nearest ghost, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "This isn't real." The ghost boy smiled and walked straight through the gun barrel like it was made of mist. Dalton pulled the trigger, but the bullet passed harmlessly through the child and buried itself in the dirt behind him. "We buried them deep." Hayes was backing toward his car now, but every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the circle of dead children instead of farther away. The mine was sealed. Morrison's judicial robes flapped around him like broken wings as he turned in circles, trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. Marie felt something change inside her as she watched the supernatural confrontation unfold below. The fear and confusion that had been driving her since she first heard Tommy's prayer on the road began to transform into something harder and more focused. She wasn't just witnessing this, she was part of it. Tommy's spirit was moving through her, using her as a conduit for justice that couldn't be denied. She stood up from behind the trees and walked down the hillside toward the three men, her phone in her hand, recording everything. The ghostly children parted to let her pass, their eyes following her movement with approval and anticipation. "You killed my brother," her voice carried clearly in the charged air, cutting through the supernatural chorus like a blade through silk. Dalton swung his gun toward her, but his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't keep it steady. "It was business, Marie. Nothing personal. Everything about family is personal." Commissioner Hayes tried to inject some authority into his voice, but it came out as a croak. "You got no proof of anything. This is all grief and imagination." Marie held up her phone, the screen showing the recording that had been running since she first entered the mine. "I got something better. I got the truth." The ghostly children pressed closer to the three men, their whispered prayers becoming louder and more insistent. Some of the ghosts were pointing at specific men, identifying their killers with accusations that didn't need words to be understood. Judge Morrison fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his ears like he could block out the voices of the dead. "Make them stop. Make them go away." "They'll go away when justice is done," Marie said. She could feel Tommy's presence growing stronger around her, his spirit joining with hers in a way that felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. Hope walked over to stand beside Marie, her small hand slipping into Marie's larger one. When she spoke, it was with her own voice again, clear and strong and very much alive. "Tell them about the trucks." Marie looked at the three men who were now huddled together like children afraid of the dark. "The trucks that come at night, the children you move through the mine system like cargo, the graves marked with numbers instead of names." Dalton's gun fell from his nerveless fingers and hit the ground with a sound like a gavel striking wood. "You don't understand. It's bigger than us, bigger than this town." "Then give me names." Marie stepped closer, the phone still recording, the ghosts still circling. "Give me everyone who's part of this. Everyone who's been selling children like their livestock." Hayes was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the ghostly children surrounding them. "We just moved them. We didn't kill them all. Just the ones who fought back." Marie's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Just the ones who tried to escape. Just the ones who reminded you that they were human beings instead of property." "They were already broken," Morrison whispered from his knees. "Already damaged. We were just making use of something that was going to waste anyway." The ghostly children's prayers grew louder at his words, their voices rising in a crescendo of rage and sorrow that made the ground beneath their feet tremble. Marie felt Tommy's spirit surge through her like electricity, filling her with the strength and purpose he'd never lived long enough to fulfill. She held the phone higher, making sure the camera captured everything, the three men cowering in terror, the circle of dead children demanding justice, Hope standing brave and alive beside her, wearing a flannel shirt that had become a symbol of protection and hope. "Say their names," Marie commanded, and her voice carried the authority of the dead, speaking through the living. "Say the names of every child you killed. Say them out loud so they can finally rest." The ghostly children pressed closer, their whispered prayers becoming a roar that filled the morning air with the sound of justice that could no longer be denied. Marie held her phone steady, the screen showing hours of recorded footage that contained everything. Every confession, every threat, every casual discussion of moving children like cattle. The three men huddled together in the circle of ghostly children looked like exactly what they were, predators caught in their own trap with nowhere left to run. 27 children dead, dozens more missing. Marie's voice cut through the supernatural chorus like a judge reading a verdict. All of it documented, all of it recorded. Sheriff Dalton tried to straighten his shoulders, tried to find some of the authority he'd worn like armor for so many years. "You can't prove anything with ghost stories and wild theories." Tommy's notebook, your own words, the graves in the mine. Marie took a step closer, the phone still recording, the dead children still circling. 3 hours of you confessing to everything. Commissioner Hayes was shaking his head like he could deny reality through sheer force of will. "Nobody will believe ghost stories." They'll believe federal agents. The words hit the three men like physical blows. Dalton's face went pale. Hayes started backing toward his car again, and Judge Morrison made a sound like a wounded animal. "What are you talking about?" Marie smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. "I called the FBI 6 hours ago, soon as I found Tommy's evidence in his apartment. Sent them copies of everything, his notebook, the photos, the courthouse letters." She held up the phone. "This recording is just insurance." "You're lying." Agent Sarah Chen, Crimes Against Children Division. She's been working trafficking cases in rural areas for 8 years. Marie could see the recognition in their eyes. They knew the name. They'd been waiting for someone like Agent Chen to find them for a long time. Turns out the FBI has been watching this county for months. Tommy's evidence just gave them what they needed to move. The ghostly children around them began to change, their forms becoming less solid, more transparent. As their stories were finally being heard, as justice was finally coming for their killers, they were finding the peace that had been denied to them in life. One by one, they began to speak their names. Not the numbers they'd been marked with in death, but the names their parents had given them, the names that had been stolen along with their lives. Sarah Mitchell, a girl who looked about 10 years old, her form already fading like morning mist. "I like to draw horses." Michael Santos, a boy with gap-toothed smile. "I was going to play baseball when I grew up." Jennifer Walsh, a teenager with eyes that had seen too much. "I had a little sister. I hope she's safe." Each name hit the air like a hammer blow, and with each name spoken, the ghostly children became more transparent, more peaceful. Their anger was finally being heard. Their stories finally being told to people who would do something about it. Hope walked over to where the three men cowered, her small form still solid, while the other children faded around her. When she spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had survived what the others couldn't. "Tommy tried to save us. Now his sister's going to finish what he started." Judge Morrison was crying openly now, his judicial robes stained with tears and dirt. "We didn't mean for it to get this big. It started small, just a few runaways nobody would miss." Nobody would miss. Marie's voice was sharp enough to cut stone. "You hear that? Every child you killed, every life you destroyed, you told yourself nobody would miss them. The families were paid," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones who asked questions. We made sure they were taken care of." "With money from selling their children." Commissioner Hayes nodded like he thought this made it better somehow. "Everyone got what they needed. The families got compensation, we got our cut, and the buyers got what they wanted." Marie felt Tommy's spirit surge through her one more time, filling her with rage that burned clean and pure. What you wanted was money. What those children wanted was to live. The sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the hillside, multiple engines coming fast up the dirt road to the mine. Marie looked toward the sound and saw a convoy of black SUVs with government plates, followed by state police cars with their lights flashing. "Agent Chen, I presume." Hope walked over to Marie, her form becoming more transparent with each step. The other ghostly children had already faded completely, their names spoken, their stories told, their spirits finally at rest. "Will I see Tommy now?" Hope's voice was getting fainter, like she was speaking from a great distance. Marie knelt down to be at eye level with the child who had started all of this, who had been brave enough to find her and speak Tommy's prayer. "I think he's been waiting for you. Will you remember us?" "Every single day." Hope smiled and reached into the pocket of Marie's flannel shirt, the shirt that had become a symbol of protection and hope for a child who had needed both. She pulled out something small and wooden and placed it in Marie's hand. It was a cross carved from pine wood with a child's careful hands. Marie recognized it immediately. Tommy had made it in Sunday school when he was maybe 8 years old. Proud of his clumsy craftsmanship and the way it fit perfectly in his pocket, she'd thought it was buried with him. "He wanted you to have this back." Marie looked down at the cross, feeling the weight of memory and love and loss all concentrated into a few inches of carved wood. When she looked up again, hope was gone, faded away like morning frost touched by sunlight. The FBI vehicles reached the mine entrance, and agents in tactical gear poured out, weapons drawn, moving with the professional efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Agent Chen was exactly what Marie had expected. Mid-40s, calm eyes that had seen too much, and the kind of presence that made everyone around her stand up straighter. Marie Carpenter. That's me. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We got your evidence package. Hell of a thing your brother put together. Chen looked at the three men who were now surrounded by federal agents. Dalton, Hayes, Morrison. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, murder in the first degree, and about 20 other charges I don't have time to list. Sheriff Dalton tried one last time to assert authority that no longer existed. You got no jurisdiction here. Actually, I do. Chen held up her badge. Federal crimes, federal jurisdiction. Your little trafficking network crosses state lines, which makes it my problem to solve. Marie watched as the three men were handcuffed and read their rights, the words carrying across the morning air like a prayer, finally being answered. Other agents were already entering the mine, following the evidence Tommy had gathered to find the graves that needed to be properly marked, the children who needed to be identified and returned to families who had never stopped looking for them. Agent Chen walked over to Marie, her expression serious but not unkind. Your brother's work is going to expose a trafficking network that spans at least 6 states, maybe more. What he did, what you finished, it's going to save a lot of children. Marie closed her hand around Tommy's wooden cross, feeling its weight against her palm. He would have liked that. We're going to need you to testify when this goes to trial. I'll be there. As the law enforcement convoy departed with their prisoners, Marie stood alone on the hillside above the Whitmore mine. The morning sun was burning off the last of the supernatural atmosphere that had surrounded the confrontation, leaving behind only ordinary daylight and the memory of justice finally served. She whispered Tommy's prayer one more time, but changed the ending. Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door, and let the truth set the children free. The wooden cross in her hand felt warm, like it was holding on to the memory of her brother's love. 6 months later, Marie stood in a field where the Whitmore mine entrance used to be. The FBI had sealed the tunnels with concrete and steel, filling in the passages where so many children had suffered and died. But instead of leaving the place as a scar on the landscape, the town had built something better. Something that honored memory instead of trying to forget it. The memorial garden spread across the hillside like a promise kept. 27 small crosses marked the spots where the children's bodies had been found, each one carved with a name the ghostly children had whispered before they found peace. The crosses were made from local pine, simple and clean, arranged in a circle around a stone bench where visitors could sit and remember. Marie walked among the crosses, reading names that had been stolen and then returned. Sarah Mitchell, Michael Santos, Jennifer Walsh. Tommy's name was there too, carved into a cross that stood slightly apart from the others, marking his role as the one who had tried to save them all. A car pulled up the gravel road that led to the memorial, and Marie recognized the license plate. The Morrison family from 3 counties over, coming to visit their daughter's grave for the 2nd time this month. She walked over to meet them as they got out of their car. Mrs. Morrison was crying before her feet touched the ground. We wanted to thank you. Don't thank me. Thank Tommy. Thank them. Marie gestured toward the crosses. They're the ones who found the courage to speak. Mr. Morrison looked older than his years, bent by grief that would never fully heal. How do we honor children we never knew? By making sure it never happens again. The couple walked to their daughter's cross and knelt in the grass beside it, their hands touching the wood like they could somehow reach through death to comfort the child they'd lost. Marie gave them privacy and walked back toward her truck, where 3 children waited in the back seat. The FBI raids had rescued 12 children from the trafficking network that had spread across 6 states. Most had been returned to families who'd never stopped looking for them. But 3 had nowhere else to go. Families destroyed by the same system that had stolen the children. Marie had taken them in without hesitation, giving them the safety that Tommy had tried to provide. Marcus was the oldest at 14, the boy who had kept count of days with scratches on the mine wall. The 2 girls, Sarah and Emma, were sisters who'd been separated for 2 years before being reunited during the rescue. All 3 were learning to trust again, learning that not all adults were dangerous, learning that home could be a place where children mattered more than profit. Can we go see Tommy's cross? Marcus asked as Marie climbed into the driver's seat. Course we can. They walked to Tommy's memorial together, the three children arranging wildflowers they'd picked along the roadside. Marie knelt beside them and touched her brother's name carved into the pine wood. Feeling the same warmth she'd felt from his wooden cross that first day, Hope had given it back to her. "He would have loved you kids," she said. "Think he can see us?" Emma asked. She was 8 years old and still young enough to believe in things that adults had forgotten how to see. "I think he can." That evening, after dinner and homework and the ordinary rituals of family life that Marie was still learning to navigate, she tucked the three children into beds in the house where she and Tommy had grown up. The place felt alive again, filled with voices and laughter and the sound of children running up and down stairs that had been silent for too long. "Why do we say this every night, Marie?" Sarah asked as they prepared for the bedtime prayer that had become their family tradition. "To keep the wolves from the door." "And the truth from the liars?" Marie smoothed Sarah's hair back from her forehead. The same gesture she'd made for Tommy so many years ago. "No, baby, we keep the truth from becoming lies." The three children closed their eyes and recited Tommy's prayer together, their voices joining in harmony that sounded like hope made audible. "Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door and the truth from dying with us." After the children were asleep, Marie sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watched stars appear in the darkening sky. The wooden cross Tommy had carved as a child hung from a chain around her neck, a reminder that love doesn't end with death, that family extends beyond the boundaries of life and loss. That's when Hope appeared one last time. She came walking across the yard like she was made of moonlight and memory, translucent and peaceful, wearing the same flannel shirt Marie had given her that first day on the road. But now she looked different, younger somehow, like death had given her back the childhood that had been stolen from her in life. "They're safe now." Hope's voice carried clearly across the distance between them. "All of them?" "All of them." Hope sat down on the porch steps beside Marie, and for a moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sharing evening conversation with the ghost of a child who had saved so many others by being brave enough to speak the truth. "Tommy. He says he's proud of his sister." Marie felt tears start, but didn't try to stop them. These were good tears, the kind that came from love and gratitude instead of grief and loss. Hope stood up as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, her form becoming more transparent with each passing moment. "Take care of them." "I will. And take care of yourself." "I'll try." Hope smiled and walked away across the yard, fading with each step until she was nothing more than morning mist that would burn off with the first full touch of sunlight. But Marie felt her presence linger, a blessing that would stay with her for as long as she lived. Marie stood up and removed the flannel shirt she'd been wearing, the same one she'd given to Hope that first day, the one that had become a symbol of protection and hope for children who needed both. She hung it on a hook by the front door, where it would be ready if another shoeless child came walking up the road. Tomorrow, there might be someone who needed kindness from a stranger. Someone who needed to know that not all adults were dangerous, that some people could be trusted to help instead of hurt. Marie whispered Tommy's prayer to the sunrise, feeling his spirit in every word. "Dear Lord, keep the wolves from the door and the truth from dying with us." The flannel shirt hung by the door like a flag of surrender to hope, ready to be given to the next child who needed it more than she did.